Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm Kavitafway. Negotiating a decade-old dispute is a very difficult process, especially when it involves parties who have not trusted each other or did not have diplomatic relations in 30 years. That is the case between Iran and the United States. And take the other permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany in Iran's nuclear talks, and you have a monumental task of getting a deal down on paper, which is what is happening in Geneva in day 4 of Iran's nuclear talks, where a deal seems elusive. An Iranian official says there's a dispute over the wording of the draft deal. In this debate, we'll discuss whether what goes on paper as an interim deal is something that Iran can actually trust, and also discuss whether this deal has political aspects weighing in on each country's decision. Let me introduce our guest. Author and historian Webster Griffin Tarpley joins us from Washington. And we have senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, Richard Weiss, who joins us also from Washington. Gentlemen, welcome. Let me start with you, Webster Griffin Tarpley. Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif says the interim agreement must include the right to enrichment. Tell us, why has this posed such a big challenge when Iran has said that in terms of the level, location, and volumes, that is up for discussion?
Well, it seems to me this is an artificial issue raised by people who don't want any agreement on the Western side. Certainly, from the point of view of international law, every country has an inherent right to practice the entire nuclear fuel cycle for peaceful purposes. And that includes enrichment, that can include a heavy water reactor, it can include all sorts of other technologies that can be carried out under an inspection regime, which Iran has accepted and which it has respected. If you don't have the full nuclear fuel cycle, you don't really have the dignity and independence of an independent country, a sovereign state, in the modern world. And what we've got is this absurd situation where the regional adversaries of Iran, starting with the Israelis, but now backed up powerfully by Saudi Arabia, have tried to erect this totally artificial treatment for Iran, to single out Iran. Under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it seems to me, there is an inherent right to enrichment as well as all other peaceful technologies. But there's an attempt to discriminate, to set up a double standard or maybe a triple standard. And unfortunately, last week we were very close, I think, to some kind of an accord. The opportunists in the French government, Fabius and Hollande, probably joined by the British, have tried to make themselves into the lawyers to some extent for Israel, but mainly for Saudi Arabia, and have sabotaged the deal that was available a couple of weeks ago. The Obama administration here in Washington, I think, realizes that it has a vital interest in making a peace deal and getting this nightmare vision of a Middle East war off the table. Netanyahu, of course, a loose cannon, a desperate demagogue whose entire political career has been built on causing turbulence and conflict. Right now, Netanyahu's stock here in Washington is very, very low. And nobody in this country wants to be dragged into a general war in the Middle East to serve the demagogic career of Bibi Netanyahu.
Richard Weiss, this is not the first time that I'm hearing this based on different analysts that have come, and Webster Griffin Tarpley has stated what has been repeated now over and over again, that Israel does not want to have a Middle East that's living in peace and stability, and to have security established as the word of the day. And also, Webster Griffin Tarpley said that the U.S. wants to get this deal aside. Do you agree with that viewpoint?
I disagree that Israel doesn't want to see a Middle East at peace, with peace and stability, since that would presumably de facto recognize Israel's current situation as legitimate rights to exist and so on. With respect to the other arguments, I think he's right about the enrichment, that's a tough one for the Western negotiators to insist on, that at least just the principle of Iran's right to enrich, it's basically in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The argument has been that there have been uncertainties about some Iranian activities in the past, some covert enrichment that took place before it was made public to the IAEA, as Iran's supposed to do, a lot of technical violations and some questions about what the intent was of the past efforts. And that is seen to somehow constrain what Iran can do in its future enrichment activities. And that makes sense. But denying the right to enrich is a bit harder, and I think they're going to give away on that one at some point.
Yeah, there has been, Webster Griffin, Tarpley, certain hints of that. U.S., for example, hinting at a compromise on enrichment. But of course, this is all based on speculation because everything's held in secret. Let's look at just the mere fact of a deal being drawn here. And of course, this goes along how Iran feels that maybe it cannot trust, even if a deal was to be placed. And that, I'm going to go to the 1981 Algiers Accord, if you recall, that was broken by the U.S. So does Iran have a worry for this deal to actually be broken, in particular maybe by one of the countries being the U.S.?
Well, naturally, that old Russian maxim about trust but verify applies in both directions, right? The Western powers are going to insist on a maintenance of the inspection regime, but Iran, of course, in return, has a right then to demand the immediate loosening, or I would say the immediate abolition of these crippling economic sanctions, because these are actually measures of economic warfare. I wouldn't really say, by the way, that the Israelis totally are against any deal. I'd say certainly the demagogue Netanyahu is, but if you recall, President Perez just a couple of days ago put out a warning really saying don't go against the United States quite so much there, Bibi. I think it might be time for Netanyahu's political career to come to an end and somebody more reasonable to come in. The problem, of course, from the United States point of view is that it's U.S. aid that allows Netanyahu to run wild. If Israel were there relying on its own resources, they would have to form some kind of a modus vivendi, some kind of a way to get along. The most dangerous concept, I think, is the notion of nuclear weapons capability. A nuclear weapons capability simply means that you're a developed country, right? There are dozens of countries around the world that have the capability simply because of their general level of economic development, but they've chosen not to go down this path, and it seems to me that is what Iran would also do. Therefore, if you're going to have some kind of a point of discrimination is, are you going to build a nuclear bomb? Iran says there is no intention for a nuclear bomb. The inspectors say there is no preparation for a nuclear bomb. So I think we should just get that issue off the table. And again, repeat that everybody has an inherent right under natural law, under God's law. Everybody has a right to economic development. And that necessarily means you're going to have the capability of peaceful nuclear energy on the side.
Well, along the lines of economic development, Richard Weiss, I need to get this covered because some believe that this maybe is just a question about market share. I'm going to refer back to the deal that was on the table in 2005, that was being discussed, I should say, in which there was a clause there stating that an EU declaration recognizing Iran as a major source of energy for Europe needs to be cited in the final deal. Now, I'm putting that along with Russia's interest of being one of the biggest supplier of gas to Europe. So could we perhaps see a conflict of interest there when it comes to, for example, market share? In this particular example that I used, Russia obviously not wanting this to happen.
Well, I think even more significantly, if I were Russia or China, I wouldn't want to see a reconciliation between Iran and the West. Iran's natural security and economic partners are the United States and Western Europe. In terms of their geography, its countries tend to prefer to align themselves with offshore balancers rather than neighboring countries, gives them more autonomy. In terms of economics, the trade of Iran is, as you implied, should be sending its oil and other resources to Western countries. and in turn getting their airplanes, computers, and other advanced equipment pending Iran's further development of those sectors. The sanctions, what they've done is they've interrupted that natural flow, which means that Iran's oil and resources go to China, and China and Russia are the main actors in the Iranian economy in terms of foreign actors. So they have the large corporations be involved in either nuclear exploration or other activities. And so that's interrupting the natural partnership. So as I agree with basically what you're saying, that there's another dynamic going on here in terms of the economic interests of the countries.
Well, Webster Griffin Tarpley, if you have that premise to be accepted here, at the same time, these are sanctions that were imposed by, well, the most recent ones, the unilateral sanctions by the U.S., which Europe also imposed on Iran. And then on the other hand, you're having U.S., Russia, and China using the sanctions card of exploiting this through Iran. So where does Iran's right come up in this whole scenario? I mean, Iran has to somehow then try to preserve itself, and that's why this interim deal is something that Iran is very firm on in terms of, for example, the right to enrichment, that the principle of the right to enrichment has to come down on this, so there won't be any unilateral sanctions, for example, imposed and hopefully, alleviated in the future based on this interim agreement.
Yes, I agree. There is an absolute inherent right, it pertains to national sovereignty to be able to have the full nuclear fuel cycle, including enrichment. Unfortunately, here in the U.S. Congress, we have a lot of congressmen who were getting ready to vote against the Israeli lobby back in September on the Syrian question. Right? It was clear that whatever the power of AIPAC was, it was not enough to get the United States into a war in September. So it seems to me that some of those same congressmen and senators are trying to use this as a substitute, saying to AIPAC, well, we didn't do what you wanted in September, but we'll do what you want now. I have always called for the absolute ending of all economic warfare and economic sanctions. But in terms of getting an arrangement, it seems to me the two key powers, along with Iran, are the United States and Russia. And in particular, if a deal is satisfactory to Russia, I think that would be a reassurance to Iran. If Russia accepts this deal, China, I think, will also be inclined to accept it. Similarly, if the United States accepts the deal, then the British and the French are really going to have to suck it up and go along. The British and the French antics, Fabius and Haig, remind me of the Suez Crisis of 1956. These are ex-world powers, right? The Russians talk about Britain as this little island. The French, I think, in very bad government these days with Hollande, but they seem to think that they can reassert a colonial interest in the Middle East because the U.S. is demilitarizing, hopefully, the foreign policy. And the Saudis, in particular, are complaining loudly about this. So the French think they can pick up the Saudis as a client. And we should also remember, though, that the British and the French are so weak that they're incapable of acting separately. They can only act together, right? One of them has the guns, the other one has the bullets. One of them has the left shoe, the other one has the right shoe. They can't act separately. But I would say to Kerry, if the British and the French put up more artificial barriers and try to represent this Saudi interest in sabotaging the talks, then it's time to ice them out. It's time for the British and the French to become more realistic about their actual power and influence in the modern world. And I think the U.S.-Russian relationship now emerges as something rather more promising.
Well, when you say ice them out, who are you referring to?
The British and the French should be told that if Russia and the United States agree, the British and the French should go along with it. Because remember, if there's a war, the United States will pay the price, not the British and the French with their token military forces. So enough of this militarized foreign policy. The U.S. is trying to de-emphasize it, and the British and the French are trying to gin it up.
Well, Richard Weiss, this brings us to a very important question, and I'm wondering if you can give us a ratio, perhaps, because there are other aspects to an agreement that's trying to be reached here, and obviously it's political in nature, such as Iran's cooperation in a variety of political security areas. It includes Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, of course, being the big one, not to mention terrorism and drug trafficking. When we start talking about, when they start talking about these particular points of interest, some are saying, how much does that play into the overall picture, as opposed to the technicalities of Iran's nuclear program vis-a-vis these political-related security areas or political areas?
Yeah, those are all very important areas, and I'm sure you and I can come up with a list of more, particularly what Iran would like to see the West change. But I think that for this weekend's negotiations, they're just focusing on how to get an interim agreement so that they can spend the next 6 months getting a more enduring nuclear agreement. I think that countries will differ, but I would think that Iran and the P6 could reach an agreement that just dealt with the nuclear file even 6 months from now. These larger issues are important, but perhaps you could deal with them in other formats. You know, Syria you would deal with in Geneva. Iraq and Afghanistan, there are regional organizations that you'd want to address, international terrorism, other things. I mean, I think that the nuclear issue has really taken on the main driver of the, at least in the Western countries, towards the sanctions. And I'm sure China and Iran wouldn't insist on any of these other areas being dealt with either. So I think that you can pretty much freeze a lot of that. But that is, though, the backdrop to why the logical reconciliation that we talked about between West and Iran will take a while to occur, even if they do reach a nuclear deal.
Do you agree with that, Webster Griffin Tarpley, that this time around it's really just about Iran's nuclear, civilian nuclear program that's being discussed, and not these other political in nature type topics like Iran's cooperation in Syria, for example?
This is difficult for me to judge. The one thing I can say, though, is that the political imperative for the United States is war avoidance. Obama got, I think, a very useful lesson. He got his hair mussed up back in September trying to go to the brink on Syria, and it was clear that he would have been voted down by the House, voted down by the Senate, public opinion overwhelmingly against it. The main political fact is the United States is sick of war, does not want another war. This is not a form of weakness, it's a form of maturity, it's a form of wisdom. And I think Obama and Kerry in particular, the skull and bones Secretary of State, this is something hard for him to understand. But I think both Obama and Kerry, having had this lesson, having been beat up essentially back in September and having all sorts of other problems, they, I think, have gotten the idea that they better try war avoidance rather than the brinksmanship that has been common under the neocons in the Bush-Cheney years, and unfortunately in the first term of Obama.
Well, let's get this clarified here, Webster Griffin Tarpley. I'm a little confused. When you're talking about war avoidance, tell us what type of war scenario are you talking about? And is that really such a high possibility if a deal with Iran is not reached?
Well, if you listen to Netanyahu essentially says there can be no a deal, no agreement, no modus vivendi with Iran is possible. And therefore, since Iran is going to continue with the nuclear enrichment to which Iran has, I think, an absolute right, then you're on the path to some kind of nuclear or military confrontation. And I think the idea is end that now. Netanyahu is a very mercurial figure. Generally speaking, you would doubt that the Israelis would start some kind of military action, but one never knows. Let's not find out. Let's close that door right now with some kind of preliminary accord.
Richard Weiss, do you agree with that? I mean, is that a strong possibility when it comes to Israel?
About we could circumvent Israel for reach a preliminary accord?
no, that Israel, if a deal was to be reached, then there would be a high risk in some regards of Israel going it alone. They have said that in the past in terms of Iran.
Yeah, well, you could see why they might do that, but it's very high risk. The idea would be you strike Iran and will inflict some damage, not a knockout blow. Iran then strikes back, and you sort of confront the U.S. president with the need then to intervene himself. And that might work for that scenario, but it's extremely risky. It could backfire in all sorts of ways. And if they would have done it, they've had several opportunities and they haven't. So I tend to think they won't.
Okay. Webster Griffin Tarpley, last time around it was said that France was the one who torpedoed the talks. Of course, many concluding that it was because of Israel's pressure. This time around, who do you think is the bad cop? Certain indicators that perhaps the UK is playing the bad cop in these negotiations. What do you think?
Well, the motto of the British Foreign Office has been divide and conquer since time immemorial, and I'm sure Haig would like to play that card. But of course, since the House of Commons, I think a very valuable gesture, voted against the Syrian war back a couple of months ago, Haig has to keep a rather lower profile because of his own internal politics. I would say last week or 2 weeks ago, Fabius is acting as a lawyer for Saudi Arabia. The main fly in the ointment is Prince Bandar, perhaps even more than the Israelis, more than Netanyahu. It is Bandar who wants to sabotage this. And ironically, while talking of nuclear non-proliferation, we know that Bandar has been going to Pakistan and others and setting up scenarios where nuclear weapons from these other countries would be proliferated into Saudi Arabia. Now, this is a reactionary absolute monarchy of the type that hardly exists anywhere else in the world. And somehow, though, Saudi Arabia and Qatar get to sit at the table of the democratic powers. This situation is absolutely abnormal, and I don't see how the current form of government in Saudi Arabia can continue, no matter what they do. But they're capable of doing a lot of damage in the twilight of their power.
Unfortunately, we're fresh out of time. Thank you very much, author and historian Webster Griffin Tarpley there from Washington, also from Washington, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, Richard Weitz. Thank you for watching another edition of The Debate. Any questions or comments? Newsroom@presstv.ir. From me, and the entire team here in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.